So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Lauren Lietzau. I'm from the Foundation Trust. I'm here with our Executive Director, Joseph Spinazzola, and our speaker this evening, Dr. Jana Pressley. I just wanted to give you a little bit of update. This is our first in the speaker series that Mike mentioned, and we are so glad you're joining us for this topic. It's so timely and so important to a lot of us here in our community. So we're glad to be here. We are a small private operating foundation here in Melrose, and the Melrose Human Rights Commission was one of our first grantees. So this is exciting that after we've tried to get things off the ground and then the pandemic hit, but here we are. We're glad to be here and supporting the great work that you do. Just wanted to give a little bit of overview of what the Foundation Trust is for those who don't know. And Jana, if you want to go to the next slide. So we are committed to supporting small and medium-sized nonprofits in the greater Boston area. And we are really focusing on uplifting marginalized or vulnerable individuals and communities. And we work in these 4 topic areas primarily: overcoming trauma and life adversity, elevating high-risk youth and vulnerable communities, restoring dignity and quality of care for adults living with chronic conditions, and advancing inclusivity in the arts. Our in-house expertise is in track 1, the overcoming trauma and life adversity. And so our, in addition to grant making, we also have educational components and resources such as tonight's talk. So I don't want to dig too deep into this. If you're interested, the website is down below, foundationtrust.org. I encourage you to visit us and see what we're up to and what our great partners are up to. For a little bit of housekeeping, we are recording tonight's session, so we'll be able to go back and revisit some of these items, and any great questions you have, we'll have time for at the end. But if you think of things as we go through, if you want to just put those in the chat, then those will come to me, and we'll be able to address those either as we go, if there's something that needs clarification, or we can go through them at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Jana Pressley. She is a licensed clinical psychologist, the Senior Training Associate at the Foundation Trust, as well as Director of Clinical Services at the Complex Trauma Treatment Center in Boston, and founding faculty member of the Complex Trauma Training Institute. So thanks very much for having us, and take it away, Jana.
All right, thank you, Lauren, for your introduction, and it's great to be here tonight. And I just wanted to, as Lauren kind of kicked us off by saying, at the Foundation Trust, one of those major areas of focus that you see is on support and resource development for youth and families impacted by trauma and adversity. And that's really where our focus is tonight in this talk, as we dig into two of the resources actually that we developed related to the pandemic, and families and adults and youth who have been coping with the pandemic over time. It became clear that it might be helpful to partner with the Human Rights Commission to really put this information out there and to have more of a conversation in this way. And just a little bit of a background: at the beginning of the pandemic, it became clear that there was a particularly intense impact that the isolation and so many of the variables that we've all experienced collectively, the impact on those with a history of traumatic experiences, which then led to the development of the resources that we're going to be discussing tonight. And also, as we move into the holiday, as you saw in the title of our presentation for this evening, as we move into the holiday season and the extended nature that COVID-19 has taken over the course of this year, so many of the taxes upon our coping resources have just compounded. So I wanted to start first with just the shared stressors that have been collective for all of us as a society, internationally. So over the past several months, we can sort of relate collectively with the cumulative stress and loss in the categories that you see here in front of you, that all of us have been subject to loss or restriction of our sort of usual enjoyable activities that we're used to, that help us cope with life, that help us engage with the people who we love and enjoy spending time with. We've all been impacted by just the chronic disruption of our daily routines and now our annual routines and traditions, including our holiday routines now as we've come into this season. The extended isolation from our loved ones that we're feeling the impact. And again, as we go into the holiday season, that can feel particularly noteworthy. The financial vulnerability that's come with this extended season of time, and all the complexities that leads into for individuals and families. The interruption of life goals that folks are pursuing, that have pursuing, things like education, career, and travel goals that have been so profoundly disrupted during this time. And then the threat of illness or death, or actual illness and death that has come to families and communities. And the sort of the open-ended, unknown ending to the timeline throughout the season has been taxing on all of us. So we start with this place, this common ground that we can come together, and then around, and then as we move into our next piece of considering those who have been impacted historically by traumatic experiences. I want to sort of set the scene for that a little bit, because again, we have sort of a shared experience, but then we have those who, as we developed these resources early on the year, really became our focus, and thinking about how do we think about supporting and holding in mind those with a history of past trauma and adversity. So just to give us kind of a common language and ground to start, and I wanted to kind of define, what do I mean when I'm talking about trauma? So we can first think about acute traumatic events, that there are those sort of situational experiences that folks can go through, whether it be an accident, a natural disaster, being witness to or subject to a one-time assault. And then there are the more chronic areas of traumatic experience. And these are the ones we'll be focusing or thinking most about as we're thinking through these resources this evening. Those who earlier in childhood and perhaps chronically through life experiences were survivors of various types of abuse, whether it be physical, sexual, verbal, or emotional abuse, exposure to domestic violence, community violence, and all of the impact of systemic racism and discrimination, ongoing poverty. And then we also think about those who their traumatic experiences were based in early and ongoing unmet needs. So those who were subject to chronic neglect or multiple early life disruptions, families who have coped and held the adversity of chronic mental illness or substance abuse, ongoing challenges in caregiving systems. And so when we think about those who have held those chronic experiences, and then sort of think about now the overlap of if that's my history, if I'm sort of coming into this season of time this past year with those early experiences, and now I've sort of come into this time of acute crisis where the pandemic has hit and all the many stressors that have come along with it. That as mental health professionals, so many of us early in this year were noticing just how that some of the particular ways that those folks, that the experience of the pandemic was accentuating some of those past experiences and symptoms and significant struggles. And just an example of some of the earliest, the sort of early things that many of us in this field were noticing with our clients. For example, in the early stages of the pandemic, when food supplies felt kind of low or at risk, or there was so much panic around sort of obtaining food and supplies, those with a history of significant neglect or deprivation in their life, or a history of poverty, would talk about feeling kind of increased fear of not having enough, or some of those old reactions and fears around not having enough food, not being able to have my core kind of basic needs met, were really stirring up a lot of anxiety and a lot of kind of old feelings. Or the isolation that has just been a part of what we've all had to experience in the midst of the pandemic, felt like an old familiar loneliness or an isolation that often comes with those who have experienced past trauma in their families, or profound neglect. Another example that I can share that I recall and have heard sort of so much through this time is those who carry sort of experiences of shame related to past trauma, or poor self-esteem, or just experiences of themselves as sort of not being enough. Would talk about sort of walking around in the world in masks and feel like people are looking at me like I'm diseased, right? I have this experience like people are looking at me like there's something wrong with me, right? And I think for some of us, that shared experience of feeling like it's hard to be out in the world with people because I feel unsafe. Those with this sort of significant history of traumatic experiences felt that in a different kind of way. And so just a little bit more about sort of thinking about common beliefs for complex chronic trauma survivors. These are a few of the pieces that, as we think through and summarize these, then informed some of the coping resources that we'll move into here in just a few moments. So for those who've experienced early and chronic traumatic experiences, often have ongoing sensations of the body feeling tense or painful. The experience of my emotions feel kind of hard to understand or hard to control or regulate, or I have a really hard time articulating my experience or expressing myself to others. Often the sort of chronic anxieties, my mind is reeling with fears or worries or self-doubts just in general, kind of prior to those specific to COVID-19. For those with chronic past trauma experiences, the world often feels unsafe, unpredictable. People in general can feel hard to trust, and in light of that, it can be hard to ask for help or hard to sort of ask for support. And there's a loneliness that comes with this too, right? The idea that I already kind of feel a little bit alone in the world when trauma has been my foundational experience, and feel like the world is sort of going on and functioning around me and without me. And so I lay that foundation then to talk about it, if I'm already coming into a collective international traumatic experience like COVID-19 has been. It's sort of like this present day threat that has emerged that brought along the risk to intensify all those old thoughts and feelings and fears that were already there and already present. So when trauma, a little bit about when trauma gets reactivated. So for some survivors, trauma survivors, whether it be adults or youth that some of you might be caring for as parents, as caregivers, what we know is for trauma survivors, the body's stress response system may have already been kind of overly activated coming into this time, coming into the pandemic. For folks who are still kind of actively struggling with anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress symptoms, that kind of high level of arousal and activation may have already been present when this time hit. And for others, perhaps your mind or your body have started to feel calmer over time, that folks have sort of been through seasons of therapy and healing and recovery, and had started to feel a bit sort of calmer and quieter in life and in the world. But then a season like this can be reactivating and kind of bring back some of those old familiar symptoms. And we think about this in terms of hypervigilance, sort of a common characteristic for those who have lived through chronic traumatic experiences, who learned to always be on the lookout for danger, because that was an important way of surviving. If I'm hypervigilant, I'm able to sort of attune to risks or dangers that may be around me, and it's a way to survive when the world is scary, and can be sort of this overlearned skill then that we can sort of be taken back to when the world feels scary once again. And so when trauma gets reactivated in these ways, some of the potential challenges that we can see is old, perhaps for some, old kind of survival-based coping patterns can return, or can escalate, can sort of ramp up again. So for some, perhaps ways of coping may have been to kind of shut down or check out in the past, in the past when life felt a bit scarier or kind of chronically dangerous, or perhaps reverting back to some old ways of numbing pain, whether it be substance abuse or eating for comfort, sometimes even engaging in conflict, or feeling sort of increasingly irritable in a way that perhaps was familiar in the past and has gotten sort of reignited as danger and fear gets reactivated. And then some of those self-beliefs rooted in kind of past traumatic experiences that I mentioned in the previous slides can come back to the surface, and some of those old sort of self-doubts and fears can start to feel really active again. And so I give that history then to sort of bring us up to some of the ways that we thought about at Foundation Trust as we developed this resource. How do we really think about supporting adult survivors and then also caregivers, and I'll get to that part in a moment, but adult survivors who have lived through and sought healing and support for past experiences, but now are really feeling this emerge again during this incredibly stressful time. And so how can we really support survivors in kind of ways to think about coping and continuing to seek support and get needs met during this extended time. And then at the same time, and sort of pairing with that, that so many in our community are caring for youth who also have traumatic experiences, whether you may be a teacher, you may be a parent in a variety of ways, a foster parent, an adoptive parent. Some of you in the community may work in residential treatment programs. And so there are a lot who are caring for incredibly vulnerable youth with histories of traumatic experience who are also then now really activated during this time. And we see emotional responses and behaviors sort of getting reactivated and revved up in distinct ways during this time. So, and one thing that I'm incredibly aware of tonight as we have this discussion is that we've been having this conversation for a long time as well, right? We've been talking, and so many of you, I'm sure, have read so many resources online and talking about ways to, ways to cope, ways to sort of care for yourself. And so as we come into the season, we acknowledge that this is both sort of an extended time when some of our resources that we were starting to rely on earlier in the pandemic, perhaps as we go into this holiday season as well, we sort of recommit to really thinking about how do we continue to sustain ourselves, through this difficult winter season, and especially if some of the isolation might feel intensified and going through the winter season as well as going through the holiday season and feeling some of the losses related to not being able to connect with family in the same way that we're used to and accustomed to during the the special time of the holiday season. So first we begin with some kind of we begin with some of our adult focused coping strategies, and starting with the idea, and I'll just kind of walk through some of these, and again we'll have some time for questions at the end. But we start with the idea of building a routine, or continuing to sort of recommit to or tweak a routine that helps support a sense of predictability and control. And the lack of routine, or the lack of our sort of typical pre-pandemic routines has been a stressor for so many. And again, for those with past traumatic experiences, it can feel something that just can throw us off kilter, right? So building and tweaking a daily routine that helps to support that sense of predictability, help us feel more regulated in our day-to-day lives. And as we think about this extended time, I think perhaps many of us figured out a routine kind of on the fly, right? As we were going through the spring and things were kind of unfolding the way that they were. And then perhaps going into the summer season, a different sort of routine needed to be put into place, especially if for those who have children in the home, or whose lives and routines shift going into the summer season. And now we go into a new season of school that looks different this fall than it did at the sort of crisis state in the spring. And so we've had sort of other times along the way where we've needed to rebuild and reconfigure those routines, but hopefully also building in some ways to care for ourselves in the midst of that. Maintaining a connection with your community in a way that is intentional. And I will say, I know so many people have had conversations about the sort of Zoom and video conference fatigue that came with having to recalibrate, connect with people that you aren't able to connect with in person right now in this virtual way. And so finding ways to sort of maintain the stamina to do that, and to do so creatively, because of that need to still be connected to our people, right? Even though it is altered now in the way that feels best to us. Incorporating a sense of closeness or safe physical touch as a comforting element. So finding ways to sort of curl up or connect with those who we find as comforting resources, whether it be a partner or a child or a family pet, or even just something soothing and comforting to us to sort of help bring some of our stress level down when we're feeling especially particularly activated. And as we consider a lot of these different kind of coping strategies that we talk about, something that can be helpful to learn to do is sort of, as you tune into your body, assessing whether your body needs some kind of input or some sort of strategy that either brings your energy up or brings your energy down. So often we hear about finding some way to cope, or finding some way to calm ourselves down. But when we're in different states, we need different things, right, at different times. And so sometimes when we are distressed, our energy can feel too high, right? We can feel kind of all revved up and agitated. Perhaps we feel a high level of anxiety. You see a word in there I included called hyperarousal, when the body kind of feels revved up in that sort of way. And in those sort of moments, we need sort of soothing input to our bodies. We need things that can sort of calm us down, bring down that energy. Whereas at other times, our distress may leave us feeling kind of shut down or withdrawn or numb. We may feel kind of checked out or in more of a depressive state. And in those states, or another word for that is hypoarousal, in in those states, so we need something different, right? Perhaps we need ways of coping and engaging our minds and bodies that bring our energy level up, that help us feel more engaged with the world, more connected to other people, to sort of bring our body's level of activation up a bit more, so that we're not quite as withdrawn or kind of shut down. And so in the midst of that, in the midst of sort of assessing what does my body need and where does that energy need to go, then there are several other sort of categories or strategies that can be helpful to us kind of throughout our days and to build into our routines. So considering a practice, a sort of mindfulness practice that can include a variety of things, but throughout our day. So perhaps a deep breathing practice, or a meditation, or yoga, or stretching practice, or a guided imagery practice. And a big piece with mindfulness, and so many people, it's such a buzzword that a lot of people are familiar with already, but an important starting place in sort of noting mindfulness is we're starting with kind of noticing and honoring and validating our own feelings, noticing what our emotions are, what is my anxiety or fear that's coming up right now, what is the sort of perhaps old thought or fear from past traumatic experiences, past senses of danger, and not sort of shutting that out, not feeling embarrassed or condemning myself for whatever that feeling is, but noticing and honoring that it's there for a reason, and then bringing some of these practices in to ease some of the distress that comes up for us in those moments. And then another category would be considering movement or exercise as a way to sort of cope and manage that distress, and to bring our stress and distress back into a calmer state. And one thing we've learned from the sort of field of trauma treatment research is that that moving the body, that even shifting our body's position, sometimes if we're feeling kind of shut down, or we're feeling vulnerable, even to get ourselves into a more upright or powerful stance can slightly even shift how we're experiencing ourselves in the moment, and bring increased regulation, or moving the body and getting active in a way that that can be helpful as well. Whenever it feels possible, when it feels safe in the context where you live, being able to get outside, to continue to be intentional when it's possible to get into nature, to get breaths of fresh air, to be able to take those activities and movement we talked about and get outside to do that as well, to continue our engagement with the world, with life. And then for those, and again, with our focus on those with past traumatic experiences, if you're feeling particularly triggered by a memory or an emotion connected to past trauma that's getting evoked during this time, being able then to notice that and engage in thoughts or activities that can sort of ground you back to the present day. So often for those with past traumatic experiences, if I'm feeling danger in the moment, it can kind of feel like I'm reliving that danger. And so grounding can be a strategy that connects us back to the fact that I'm here and I'm in this place now, that may still feel a little unsafe because of the pandemic that's happening, but I'm in a different state than I was in the past when life felt scary. And perhaps I have people with me who feel more supportive or safer, those that I can reach out to. And so in in the spirit of grounding, often using the senses to be able to even focus on what's right in front of me in the moment can be helpful. What can I, if I'm feeling really distressed and sort of in danger from past experiences, what can I see or hear or touch or smell or taste right now that can remind me that panic is a memory and not happening in the present. Even things like feeling the sensation of my feet on the floor, the sensation of taking a drink of water, that helps remind me of my present day experience. Another category that we talk about in the resources, thinking about creativity as a important kind of category of coping and enrichment. So engaging in creation that brings you satisfaction, and we all have different things that we feel that we enjoy, or we feel that we're good at, or even if we don't feel like we're good at it, but it feels fun and it brings pleasure, whether it's baking or painting, or maybe writing a short story, or putting together a photo album or a collage, or something that helps me feel like I'm still connected to my identity. I'm still connected to something that makes me feel like I'm creative in the world. And at the same time, not everyone feels that same level of creative energy, and some feel like being sort of more in their heads and getting focused on a problem that can be solved, or a problem-solving task like a puzzle, or a jigsaw puzzle, or crossword puzzle, or a chess game, or something like this can kind of help calm some of the anxious thoughts that can also often start swirling when we're feeling really triggered by stress. And then identifying or remembering, reconnecting to personal sources of positivity. So coming back to things that you know, and perhaps have historically inspired you or brought you comfort or joy, and finding a way to build some of those practices into your daily routine. I remember kind of early on in the pandemic, so many videos going around, right? People finding kind of inspirational stories, right? Or finding sort of funny things to make them laugh. If humor, it feels like an important outlet for you, or finding ways to reconnect to or nurture your spirituality during this time, and really remind yourself of who you are, and that sort of core identity of what brings you joy and what brings you meaning and purpose in life, even during a dark time, and sometimes especially during a dark time, as a reminder of what can sustain us. And then and this has been sort of episodic throughout this season as well, right? So many times when new pieces of news have surged, and it can be really overwhelming when new data is coming out, right? Or new bleak COVID numbers. So finding some sort of balance that works for you, that helps you feel informed if that feels important, and regulating, but also maybe limits and overload of news and media input. It can maybe even be helpful to put some of your own parameters around too much intake that can be overwhelming, which sometimes can mean social media as well, right? To find ways to limit the kind of onslaught of data that can be and can feel like too much. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, reminding ourselves that asking for help is not only important but essential, that we reach out and connect when we can. And so, and I think particularly in identifying those people in your life who you know or have a sense might be supportive and non-judgmental, to sort of show up and be a presence for you in need. And then when you're feeling calm and feeling like it would feel good and natural to give back, also opening yourself up to be that type of emotional support for others, right? And to be a reciprocal relationship that is comforting and supportive. So as we walk through all of those kind of adult focused coping resources and things to consider, we now move into considering really many of the same categories. As we walk through these slides, you'll see a lot of the same strategies, but we're shifting now to thinking about how, as adults and as caregivers, do we support youth, and particularly youth with a history of trauma and adversity, in navigating these same challenges. And for some of you, as adults, you may not relate to the past traumatic experiences personally, but perhaps you're in a role where you're supporting youth who do, right? If you're a teacher, if you're a coach, if you're perhaps someone who has regular contact and support with youth who are holding, even in ways that aren't visible from the outside looking in, but if you know their stories, are holding past trauma and adversity, these strategies are then shifting to focus on how do we support youth. And when we consider intergenerational trauma, some of you listening may relate on both levels, may have your own past traumatic experiences or hardships that feel activated during this time, and you're also parenting and sort of holding the experience of youth who are feeling distressed during this time. So that sort of double stress that comes with supporting oneself as an adult, as a caregiver, and then also being there and showing up for the kids in your care. And so with that in mind, in supporting youth coping, the first important place really is, as an adult, to start with caring for yourself. And often I think folks can feel, and parents, in these conversations can feel like, is that okay? Is that selfish to first care for myself, or to also sort of consider my own experience? And what we know or believe to be true is that the best resource for an overwhelmed or stressed child or adolescent is a calm, regulated adult. If you're able to be in a state where you can attune to and manage your own experience, that helps you best be able to be present and calm and for the youth in your care. And at the same time, it's important to remember that it's not easy as an adult or just as a human to be consistently calm and regulated in the season that we're in right now. That's a tall order for any of us. And so in the midst of this commitment to care for yourself so you can be the best possible presence for kids, being gentle with yourself in those inevitable moments when you do lose your patience, right? Or you become more anxious than you would hope to. And just know that as you recognize that and are able to be gentle with yourself, then you can sort of take a step back and come back to a place of being regulated again and reconnecting with the youth in your care. And so this means, as a caregiver who is supporting youth, and particularly trauma impacted youth, as much as possible, staying connected to your own community for support during this time, and perhaps particularly carving out time to connect with loved ones and friends who have work in common with you, perhaps others who are foster parents, if that's a role that you find yourself in, or others who are teachers or principals or administrators at schools supporting kids during this time. It can just be helpful to have a group, have a community support who even speak the same language as you, and particularly when it means walking alongside kids who are trying to navigate this time as best as they can. And another piece of doing this, then another piece of being a sort of a calm and regulated caregiver, is is really getting curious about when the kids in your care are showing some of the reactions or the behaviors that seem perhaps even intensified from their usual behaviors during this time of pandemic. Beginning with curiosity around how might this pandemic time really be triggering some of the past experiences that my child is going through right now, or the kids in my care are going through. I mean, I've heard and had similar worries too, like my child has gotten addicted to gaming during this time, right? Well, maybe that's a coping strategy, right? And maybe that's something that's unique to this era, and not that they've lost all interest, right, and all creativity, but they're going through an experience where isolation feels overwhelming, right, or other possibilities feel difficult to connect to. But so as we observe the behaviors, the emotional responses, and especially if they're heightened, just slowing down to sort of ask that question: how might my child's current behaviors be triggered during this time? And when we can allow ourselves as parents, as caregivers, to have that space to pause, to be curious about our children's responses, then we can better understand, we can better kind of show up and soothe them and support their needs. And in the midst of doing this, we're also modeling, right? Because then as we slow down, as we ask our kids, what's happening right now? I wonder what this is about, and creating opportunities for dialogue, or creating opportunities for redirection into healthy coping strategies. We're teaching and cueing youth to then start to be curious about their own experiences and responses. We're modeling a way for them to start to learn for themselves. Well, what is going on inside of me right now? Why and how am I so activated? And what can I do to sort of help myself and bring down my stress level, or engage in some other way? In the support of youth who are feeling stressed, incorporating, and you'll recognize some of these strategies then moving forward as ones that we talked about in terms of adult self-care. But now think about supporting your child, or the kids perhaps in your classroom, and how they can incorporate closeness or safe physical touch. So kids at home in the midst of their families, their loved ones who they're safely interacting with, how can we encourage and really create opportunities for touch, for connection, for playing with the family pet, some way of sort of keeping closeness and touch alive in our experience, even when we're feeling so isolated and disconnected from other people who we would typically be connected to. With a caveat to that, with some kids who are impacted by chronic early trauma, is there are some youth who don't like to be hugged or touched, or sort of avoid physical contact. And so also holding that caveat is something to know, but finding ways for those youth to find physical comfort otherwise. As we talked about routines in our own lives as adults, finding ways to maintain a daily routine that helps support our kids and their sense of predictability and control. And as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, we've had to recalibrate those routines as we've gone through the different actual seasons of the year and the different sort of iterations of what academic life has looked like. So finding ways to build in routine that helps kids feel some sense of a predictable life. But then also along with that, and again, particularly important with kids impacted by past trauma, helping youth find some opportunities for choice and for control, even, and it may feel it may feel like these are small things or even petty choices, but even small things like, you know, what should we have for dinner on Tuesday, pizza or burgers, right? What should we do this weekend, watch a movie or another Netflix show? Even the smallest of sort of choices can help kids feel like they're having some voice in a time when so many experiences have felt depleted or limited. In the same way that we talked about as adults supporting youth in assessing what type of input or sensory input that their body needs, either to bring their energy up or down. So that same sort of hyper arousal, that sort of high revved up distress that we talked about before that might need to be brought down or soothed, or that low kind of shut down, withdrawn arousal that needs to be brought back up. Supporting our kids to sort of learn to assess that, or attuning to that and assessing that in them and with them, and then guiding them into activities that sort of help adjust that energy in a way that's that feels more comfortable in their bodies and feels like it can get them to a more engaged and effective place. And so you know, as we know our own children that we're raising, or the kids that we work with, we can start to pick up on some of these cues and kind of know what our kids even look like, or how they respond to us, if they're just kind of like shut down, in more of a shut down place, or if they're getting more agitated. And sometimes verbally we can engage with them and sort of explore that. And sometimes it's just moving into action and saying, hey, come do this thing with me, right? Or hey, let's come sit down together, and sort of proposing an activity. Or hey, let's go throw a ball together, or something that can shift that energy in a way that feels right for the moment. If in the spirit of our kids who are trauma survivors, if you start to see kids that may be exhibiting signs that they're feeling particularly triggered by a memory or an emotion connected to past trauma, this takes us back to that conversation of grounding that we had earlier. So then helping, just like adults can do for themselves, helping kids to ground themselves back to the present. Perhaps if you are a parent or caregiver with a child who had experienced previous danger, and you have started to learn the signs of what happens in them when that shows up again, whether it be kind of in a flashback or in a change in their mood state, being able to help remind them, hey, we're here now. This feels like a stressful time, but I'm here with you now. You know, and finding ways to focus them in on the present through some of those activities that we talked about before, grounding to what can they see or hear or touch right now, and engage in something that's really present day to help really create a physical, in the moment reminder of the safety that they have now in your life with them. And in that, supporting youth in building some of their own mindfulness practices, being able to, and this is something, of course, that parents and kids can do together, learning to breathe together, or doing stretching or yoga together, or some sort of physical activity that can be shared, and can also be adults sort of guiding and modeling youth, and truly in coping mechanisms for the now, but then also in lifelong strategies and lessons to how to care for myself and help sort of support myself through difficult times as our youth continue to mature. And again, you know, in all the ways that are possible and feel safe, to be able to get kids outside too and stay active in those ways, in whatever ways they can, to continue the self-care that is so accentuated by getting out in nature and moving in the outside. Whether it be indoors or outdoors, finding way to support and enable youth to keep movement into their daily routine, whether that be engaging athletically or in brief vigorous exercise, in ways that can be playful through dance. Maybe some of our older youth are into even weight training or ways to really kind of expend and healthily kind of cope with some of the energy and stress that can build up. And then also helping youth to be identifying their own personal sources of positivity, of things that bring them humor or inspiration. And for our younger kids, sometimes that's something we're doing together, right? We're helping kids connect to things that we know that they might find funny or inspiring. And sometimes for adolescents, it's giving them the resources and pointing them in the direction to find some of that in themselves as they've grown more independent and autonomous. And then supporting youth efforts to maintain connection with their peers outside of our homes as much as possible. I mean, it's such a weird time where a year from now a year ago we would have had such different conversations than we're having now around phone use and ownership for kids, or online gaming where kids are talking to each other, or video chats, where now it's still a dilemma for parents, right? How much do I lean into technology? How much do I try to limit this online time? And yet right now, so many ways that kids are connecting with each other has to be virtually. So finding ways as families or as systems that serve kids to creatively continue to foster those connections as much as we can. And then at the same time being thoughtful, I think, about media input for our kids. And so as kids are connected or online, how do we also have, and it's different depending on the age of your kids. For your younger kids, limiting what they hear on the news or what you're listening to or talking about in front of them if they're young and going to be prone to sort of feeling scared or overwhelmed. For our older youth and adolescents, it's more, they're going to find and be exposed to what they are, right? And so it's more about having conversations with our older youth about what to take in and how to think about it, and sort of how to filter the information that's coming at them in a thoughtful way. And as they have you as a caregiver who's facilitating those conversations, that's about the best resource that they can have. We support youth in some of the other ways to continue to lift their spirits and connect with their identities and their interests. So reminding them or bringing resources to really help them reconnect to, whether it be sports that they can still do, or the music that they know that they love, or an artistic endeavor, and just working to keep fostering that and keeping those conversations alive. And then we think about ways to support youth of color and LGBTQ youth as well, who may be feeling, whether it be in their homes or in other kind of living placements, who might be feeling more disconnected from their community of peers or mentors, who, if they were at school and in the community and in regular activities, they may feel more supported in various communities. And we know that this is a time now with youth of color and with LGBTQ youth where the isolation from and disconnection from peer communities has been devastating and really painful. So if you're in a caregiving role in which you have the opportunity to sort of support and create forums for that type of connection, so remembering how important that is and sustaining those forums throughout this difficult time. And then And then finally, just as it's important for us as adults to remind ourselves that asking for help is a good and valuable thing, doing that for our youth as well, right? And continuing to support youth and finding ways to express their need, to ask for help. And also, if in a parental role, it may not always be you, right? And it might be that as parent or direct caregiver, that you're someone that they can come to, and also continuing to remind them and facilitating processes where they had outside resources other than you before this time, right? And helping to see if there are ways to continue to foster and facilitate that so that they're getting needs, a variety of their relational needs met. And so that was a lot of words, I know, in our last hour, but that brings us kind of to a time where we can pause and have more of a conversation and questions, and these resources that I've just talked through. Complextrauma.org is where you can find them under our resource page, and so I will pause there. And I know we're going to have some facilitation of questions coming up.
Jana, I've sent you some questions. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at any of them. You probably haven't. I
have not, but I can.
They're in the chat and they're also in a text.
Okay.
And I don't want to spring them on you, so I sent like 5. So I was thinking maybe you could take a peek and see which ones of which of those you might want to address. And then it's up to you, but given the smaller group size, we also might consider unmuting everyone to have more of a kind of discussion of the topic and, any questions.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I'm definitely open to unmuting if people do have questions directly. I'd like to have a conversation. And I'm taking a look at those questions right now too.
I'm happy to pose any of those to you, or
Yeah. Well, I'll speak. I saw a couple of the questions that you sent around were related to increased mental health risks during this time, and just to note that we've certainly seen in the data increased suicide risk for youth and adults alike during this time. We've seen emergence or increase in substance abuse use during this time. So many folks who were already struggling with and in recovery. This has been a particularly challenging time for relapse. Yeah, so that's as that sort of question or comment came up about that increased risk, that is certainly something that we're seeing in the data. And related to that, there looks like there was a question that came up about red flags to look out for in loved ones, either children or adults, who may be struggling, which is an important question. I think as some of the physical symptoms of depression, I think are really important for people to be aware of and get reconnected to if you're not aware of or have learned perhaps in the past. So kids or adults who might be demonstrating significant differences in their sleeping patterns, or insomnia, differences in eating patterns or weight loss or weight gain. That's a complex one, right? Because people are stuck at home too. So just actual life patterns have changed and shifted, but the significant shifts in mood that are really showing marked differences from the person you knew kind of before this time are important to note and sort of start a conversation about, or new ways of coping that you might be concerned about if you're finding loved ones perhaps more secretive or more isolated than they were before. That's important to note as well, and particularly if youth are pulling away from family, spending more time kind of alone in their rooms, even when they've been alone all day at school, doing online school. Those are concerns to pay attention to and at least start conversations about. I'm curious, I can pause there too and see if that sort of sparks other questions or things that people want to unmute and ask about or even comment on. Feel free to, I think hearing examples that others have seen in your life or work would be great as well.
Yeah, Jana, just to comment, I work with a bunch of elderly clients, and I feel like I've seen some of those isolation tactics, or not tactics, but isolation characteristics you described, because they're in assisted livings, they can't have people come to visit them, they can't leave, and if I go to call them, normally they are not long-winded, but they're happy to have conversations and kind of stay on the phone. And I've noticed those conversations have really been shorter, and not that they're agitated, they have no interest in kind of communicating.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Just even that sort of motivation to stay engaged feels depleted. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Yeah. I've seen that as well.
Yeah. I actually, I know that Joe knows the groups of kids that we work with, just regular Boston public school children. And we engage with them in discussions around all sorts of topics that are deep, some of them 8th grade, some of them older, like loss and racism. And I'm wondering though, when you have a kid or several children and you're just seeing a screen of turned off cameras, not knowing whether kids are actually involved or not knowing how they're relating. I mean, any thoughts about, some of these topics are really deep, and not knowing if we're triggering them in certain ways or what to think about around that stuff.
Yeah, thank you, Merle. It's a great question, and I don't know what's feasible in your program as follow up, but as a mentor, as an adult in witnessing, and noticing some of the concerns that you're noting here, is there in your program, is there a possibility then to follow up with kids offline or individually, just to say, I wonder how some of these conversations are hitting you, or I just want to check in if there are kind of touch points to individually follow up? Because you're right, it's really hard to know. I think when we're looking at those blank screens with people's iPhone name, it's hard to know, how are you taking in these difficult conversations, and even if it's a supportive community coming together, how's that feeling on the other end? So that's one piece, is just seeing if there's a way to build in those sort of individual adult to youth touch points.
Yeah, hi. I have a little something to add to Merle's point, is that my little boy, 9 years old, he's in the 4th grade, and as you can imagine, he's remote learning. There are times in which some of his classmates are, the camera's off and teacher doesn't know whether or not they're engaging. Or if they turn on their laptop, shut off the camera and walk away because they're fed up, right? They're frustrated. They would much rather, do what young kids do, push each other in the hallway, crack silly jokes, and carry on, right? So one of the things that, and this may not apply everywhere, but one of the things that I applaud my boy's teacher's willingness to accept that, we have kind of like a code. in which, they could go offline. She can check in with him individually and give him that, even if it's only for like a minute and 30 seconds, give him that, individual time. And that seems to work for him, because otherwise than that, he's looking at a screen. There's 20, 25 other children on the screen, and it's one step away from chaos. So, but you could see the frustration and with the whole situation. And sometimes it's like, he just says it, comes right out and says, I can't do this. I don't want to do this anymore.
Right.
So, that's just something that we've taken a little bit of an extra step to implement for him. So at least he gets that little modicum of individual time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. No, that's wonderful, and makes perfect sense how valuable that is to him, to keep him connected. Great.
Jana, if I can, I'll just add a couple thoughts about the mental health piece. I think one thing I'm thinking about is we know for a fact nationally, and we've experienced it personally directly, like a dramatic increase in mental health services utilization during the pandemic, which is a good thing, that people are trying to access counseling and other supportive services. The bad part of that is access has gone down, both in terms of clinicians being available, therapists being available, and able to see people. And is a piece of it. The other piece of it is that some of our, we've experienced this firsthand as well, some of our clients and some of the people that we work with are experiencing isolation in a really different way. So it's one thing to talk about social distancing when you're in a partnered relationship or you're in a family, and there's limitations and restrictions and it's frustrating. There's another thing to talk about social distancing when you don't have family and you live alone and you're becoming isolated from almost all human contact. And some individuals in those situations are desperately craving that contact, a place where they can be with another human being. And so I think for me, is to sort of keep in mind those people that you know of in your family or community or neighborhood that do live alone, and are they having any kind of opportunity, if they have a pet that's protected, but do they have any kind of opportunities to connect with another person? Because what we're seeing is, empirically, we're seeing the research coming out in Japan first. In Japan, has been impacted less severely than we have, but they're studying the relationship between the pandemic and suicides, and they've exponentially increased. And so if they're happening there, and you hear about suicides, but not directly as directly related to COVID in the United States. But it's becoming a reality that for some people that isolation can be lethal. And we might not be hearing from those people how much they're struggling. And some of them, especially younger folks, might actually be conveying that distress, but probably anonymously on social media platforms or with their avatar or whatever their handle is, on those social media platforms. So they're communicating kind of to the void or to hotlines, but not to the people in their sort of social circle or family network. And so I think the risk there is very real. And the most vulnerable people are as always is the case, are becoming exponentially more vulnerable, both in terms of mental health, food security, and employment, every other risk factor. But I think it's a really stark one with mental health and that risk for suicide for folks who are getting too isolated.
Right.
So can you guys hear me on this?
Yes.
Okay. That was actually going to be my question, because I think that's what we're noting in, I'm a principal of a therapeutic day school, and I think we're really noting the lack of resources to be sharing with folks because our mental health system is so taxed right now. So I was just curious if you all have resources you're kind of going to that you might go to help families access more resources during this time? Because I agree, I feel like we're watching youth mental health really suffer right now. So trying to figure out what other resources educators or caregivers might be able to access.
Yeah, it's a great question, Sheila. I know Sheila. Hi, Sheila. And it's a great question. As far as clinicians, as far as folks who are out there who are seeing kids, is that part of what you're asking?
Yeah, I mean, part of like who you might be, or groups you might be referring to, like, clinical groups you might be referring to, or even just like free resources for families. If you guys kind of share that information with families as well. Just kind of a global, like, what resources might you all be using right now?
Yeah, we don't.
Aside from you all.
I wish we had a big resource database that we have. Well, the Foundation Trust through complextrauma.org has lots and lots of resources, but they're sort of print and video resources, that kind of human service availability. I almost think I don't believe there is an untapped pool of counselors out there. And so some of it may be getting creative and in kind of rethinking partnerships with local pastors, which has kind of fallen out of in favor the past several years for a variety of valid reasons. But and thinking about partnerships with kind of after school programs and community centers that may be able to run virtual groups for kids. Another thing that we're finding is some individuals really need help with support, and their family recognizes it, but for whatever reason, and often, whether they may be younger kids or older individuals who are resistant to the idea of therapy. And part of it may also be reframing counseling and thinking with those youth or those elders, in the community, the idea of like a consultation, and maybe it's just a package, a brief time limited opportunity to check in with somebody. And not define it in the kind of traditional way as, you're a mess and you need help. You need to go to a therapist for mental health, but that we need some support right now with kind of wellness and resiliency, and presenting it as more of in a time limited, strength based way. Finding the people to provide it is a kind of a numbers challenge right now that I don't have an easy solution for.
Yes, so much, Sheila, so much of what I've seen with professionals kind of coming together around these questions has been, at least up until recently, how do we get creative to provide the services that we're already providing to the families we're already providing them to, but doing it online in a way that keeps kids engaged when they've just spent the last 6 to 8 hours online. So I've heard a lot of those discussions, but yeah, I will echo what Joseph was saying, that the creativity sort of now and moving forward, I think is going to be important. I wish there was an untapped resource out there that I was aware of, at least.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
Oh, Mike has shared a website with us in the chat, though. That's fantastic, Mike.
Sorry, that's not for me. Kathy Harlow, she couldn't post to the chat. Kathy Harlow, I believe, works for Melrose Wakefield. But anyway, she emailed that to me right now. I just wanted to post it to the chat.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Mike, I know we're about at our sort of original time. Is there time for more? Do we want to save any time for more questions? Or?
Totally up to you. I believe my cloud storage will stop recording in 11 minutes. So other than that, it's up to you guys.
Well, one question that that you sent along a little bit earlier, Joseph, that I was just thinking about and pondering was just the the lessons learned as a service professional during this time. And I can say something about that. And I'd be curious if others in some of the roles that you've identified have lessons learned or pearls of wisdom as well that you've picked up along the way. I've been so struck with the diversity of responses, and particularly because I predominantly work with those with histories of trauma. That's kind of my area, and those that I see. And I've been so struck with the sort of concurrent resiliency and struggle during this time that so many survivors are displaying. And I say diversity, I guess, and that some folks, the way that this has hit them is in a way that perhaps a highly educated, high functioning adult may in the midst of this process became nearly agoraphobic, because it became so scary to go out into the world and feel the experience of people looking at them in the way that was suspect. And then others who sort of were able to take those survival instincts that were so strong for them early on in their life and have been able to rally during this time. And it's just really interesting to just look at how diverse folks' experiences have been. And I think it makes it, I think that's been sort of complicated for the mental health world, right? Because there's no one size fits all response to this time. That's just one observation I've had. I'm curious if others have been surprised in your roles, either as parents or principals or other kind of youth supports.
I mean, I can definitely speak to that. It's a lot more, the anxiety is a lot more significant than I've ever seen, truthfully. Like, and it's a wide spectrum range, and it has often surprised me. So I would absolutely agree with you. And it almost feels like it almost feels like, I don't know, I kind of say it almost feels like a primal fear, you know, like a really base fear that feels different to me than kind of just, because at the school I'm at, we support a lot of students with significant anxiety. And it just feels different right now. So I'd agree with you, Jana. That's what I'm seeing anyway, in education, so.
I think we can't underscore enough that this is the first focal worldwide traumatic event in a century. Mm-hmm. Right? Even the great wars didn't impact every country, every corner of the globe, and but there's no abstaining from this one. There's no neutrality in relation to this one. And I say focal because I think systemic racism has been going on for millennia, and that's an ongoing trauma that's worldwide, but not in terms of its victims, worldwide in terms of its exposure anyway. But as a sort of universal trauma that everybody's sort of sharing in some form or another, I think this is it since the Spanish flu. So that's huge, that even healthy, resilient people who've been blessed and sheltered in certain ways, protected from major life adversity, have been impacted by this in some form, pretty much worldwide.
So Jana, I have a question for you. Earlier on in your presentation, you know, you alluded to being, I don't know if I'm using the right words, but gentler to yourself, right? Then that in turn, you know, we can give it to someone else, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in as adults and in our caregiving roles, it's really easy to be hard on ourselves, right? So many of us hold ourselves to high standards, and so to try to get up every day, to create these routines, to structure a whole new kind of life, like Joseph was saying, none of us have been through this before, and suddenly, as caregivers, we're all called upon to become experts at creating routines and doing homeschooling, and also being a calm self-care expert for ourselves, so that we can do that for our children. That's it's a high order to call upon ourselves. So I think that being gentle is being able to show up for myself every day and say, okay, so I was able to do this part of that, this part not so well. Guess what? I have tomorrow again, right? And to be able to I think gentler, I chose the word gentler because I think we can be quite self-condemning, right? Or it's easy to sort of get caught in a loop of self-criticism or blame. And when that spirals, then our own anxiety and distress can take off in a way that takes us in the opposite direction of where we may want to go. And then the other piece of that I'll comment on is, with so much information out there, and there've been a whole lot of, like, this is a resource, right? So I'm guilty of being part of a resource that sent out to people, but that so many resources have talked about, here's the right way to create a routine for your child, or here's the 76 activities you can do this summer, and all of this sort of advice and data that's out there, I think can feel pretty overwhelming, or perhaps even shaming to a lot of caregivers, and especially caregivers who are perhaps at risk themselves, having to work several jobs, or already feeling taxed coming into this time, and now have all of these sort of additional roles and felt responsibility to keep our kids calm during a really distressing time. So does that answer your question, or does that get at that piece?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for the question and follow-up. All right, Mike, any follow-up or final words or closing?
That's Dory's department.
Thanks, Mike. I would just say, one, I know we're coming up on about 30 after the hour, to thank you, Jana and Foundation Trust, for just taking the time tonight to allow for us to think a little bit more about, one, how can we not only care for ourselves, but also care for the youth that we may be sitting alongside or close to in what we know is an incredibly challenging time. I know hearing the strategies that you're naming and just thinking a little bit more as a parent myself, what are some things that I could be doing, was incredibly beneficial and helpful. And just again, want to say thank you from the Human Rights Commission for the conversation tonight as well.
Great, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. And thank you everyone for attending tonight too. By all means, please continue to let us know if you have additional questions. You can find us too on our Facebook page. Again, it was great to be in this community conversation with each of you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.